Welcome back, everybody. This module is on freedom of the press in America, and it culminates with the trial of John Peter Zenger, somebody who was able to establish that truth should be a defense in the cases of libel, and in some ways open up the possibility of the press covering our government and people in authority. But before I do a lecture on John Peter Zenger, if you'll forgive me, I want to talk about my old friend, Benjamin Franklin, somebody I wrote a book about and somebody I admire for having really established what the American character is. And he was a pioneer of a free press in America. He was able, as a writer and as a publisher and as a media mogul, to always know that part of the role of the press is to keep our government and our officials accountable and occasionally to poke fun at the pretensions of the elite. Benjamin Franklin was the 10th son of a Puritan immigrant in Boston. And as the 10th son of a Puritan, he was going to be his father's tithe to the Lord. His father was going to send him to Harvard to study to become a minister. This was many, many years ago, early 1700s, back when Harvard knew how to train ministers. But Benjamin Franklin wasn't exactly cut for the cloth. He had that cheeky, rebellious streak to him. And at one point, when they were salting away provisions for the winter at his home, very young Benjamin Franklin said to his dad, "I tell you what, how about I say grace over it once and for all, we can get it done with for the entire year?" His father realized it'd be a waste of money to send him to Harvard, so he did the next best thing, which was to apprentice Benjamin Franklin to his brother, his older brother, 9 years older than Ben Franklin, his brother, James Franklin. And James was a printer and a publisher in Boston, and he ran a newspaper there. And so Benjamin Franklin decided that he wanted to become a writer for his older brother's newspaper when he was apprenticed to his older brother. Now, it was a little bit hard. He hadn't finished high school, much less gone to Harvard. So what Franklin did was he took down books from the shelf of his brother's bookstore, and found the essays of Addison and Steele. And Franklin would practice at night rewriting those essays, sometimes writing them all out, cutting them up, shuffling the paragraphs, and then seeing if he could do it in a better order. And he said, "I thought it made me a tolerable writer of English." It actually made him more than a tolerable writer. He becomes the best writer of his day and generation, and certainly the funniest writer. And so he decides to write a column just like Addison and Steele in England had done. Addison and Steele had done it for a magazine called The Spectator. Benjamin Franklin wanted to do it for his brother's newspaper, the New England Courant. Now, the New England Courant had a certain feistiness to it. Other newspapers, especially like the Boston newspaper, if you see up top there, it says published by authority. That meant that they had the governor's approval and the approval of the power structure of Boston to print what they said. And indeed, the government got to censor what they printed. But the New England Courant of James Franklin was very specifically published not by authority. So Ben Franklin's really excited about trying to write for his brother's newspaper. Some of you may have older brothers, so you can imagine what happened next. There was no way that James Franklin was going to let his cheeky, much younger brother write for his newspaper. So Benjamin Franklin decided he was going to write anonymously and see if he could get the articles in the paper. And he picked a pseudonym to write these articles, and the pseudonym was Silence Dogood. He wrote as if he were a widowed elderly woman living in the countryside of Massachusetts. That's a great leap of the imagination for somebody who was a young teenager living in Boston. But if you read the Silence Dogood letters, you begin to get a sense not only of the character of Benjamin Franklin, but the character of America that he helps develop. Silence Dogood, in the very first essay, says, well, Benjamin Franklin says, pretending to be Silence Dogood, I have a natural aversion to authority, and any trampling over my liberties makes my blood boil exceedingly. That's how you know I'm an American. He was very funny, too. In like the third or fourth Silence Dogood essay, he poked fun at the people, including his brother's friends, who had all gone to Harvard. He said, Harvard only knows how to turn out dunces and blockheads who have figured out how to enter a room genteelly, something they could have learned better and more cheaply at a dancing school. After a while, James Franklin, who's not a total dunce or a blockhead, figures out that it's young Ben Franklin, his younger brother, writing for this newspaper, writing these Silence Dogood essays, and he's pretty strict on Ben Franklin. He punishes him, even beats him, which causes Franklin to be furious. However, James Franklin gets in trouble. He gets in trouble because his newspaper is not published by authority and is poking fun of Cotton Mather and the Puritan elders and the governors and mayors of Boston. The Cotton Mather family was the most distinguished family there, and the New England Courant loved poking fun at Cotton Mather. So eventually, James gets arrested, and he's forbidden to publish the newspaper. And so he has to turn it over to his younger brother, Ben Franklin, to publish it for a while. When James gets out of jail, Ben Franklin thinks, now it's time for me to leave town. So he becomes, quite famously, a runaway. He runs away from his letters of indenture, his apprenticeship documents to his brother, and runs away to the town of Philadelphia. Famously in his autobiography, it begins with him strutting up Market Street, a little bit bedraggled after the boat trip, with 3 coins in his pocket, buying those puffy rolls that he eats, giving one of the puffy rolls to a hungry person he passes by, saying, because when you're very poor, you're always very generous, because you don't want people to think you're poor. And what does he do when he gets to Philadelphia? He becomes a printer. And he's very interested in his image. So he carts the papers back and forth to his print shop so that he can look very industrious. And then he creates a printing press and decides that he too is going to create a newspaper. It's called the Pennsylvania Gazette. And once again, like his brother, who doesn't come off that well in Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, but deserves a little bit of credit for helping train Benjamin Franklin and train him in the art of being an independent newspaper man, Benjamin Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette also pokes fun at the pretensions of the elite. And instead of the Silence Dogood essays, Franklin writes all sorts of essays in funny voices. It's his way of using a pseudonym. People kind of knew it was the editor of the paper doing it, but he called them the busybody essays. And at one point, Franklin decides that he's in a dispute about whether or not he should have published something. And he writes what he calls an apology for printers. And what he says is that printers are educated in the belief that when men differ in opinions, both sides ought to equally have the advantage of being heard by the public, and that when truth and error have fair play, the former is always an overmatch for the latter. That's always been one of the mottos of a free press in America, which is let's try to print all sides, let's let the contending sides vie out in the public, and when truth and falsity have a fair play, truth is going to win out. I want you to think about that for a while. I think that was true for much of American history. especially when newspapers took responsibility for what they said. They might also have quite different opinions. Nowadays, not quite so sure it's true. Sometimes I think falsities can have greater sway on social media, but that's something we'll discuss at the end of the course. Now, let's just admire again old Ben Franklin's apology for printers. And in our next talk, we'll get to the person who helped make that possible by being part of a great trial in 1735 in which he, John Peter Zenger, is able to win the right of a free press in America. Thanks.